To further my learning of Hindi this week, I decided to learn the Indian national anthem. As I was learning this, I began to realize how extraordinarily beautiful the words were. It sounds like poetry. India. The name rouses the hearts of Punjab, Sindh, Gujarat, and Maratha, of the Dravid and Orissa and Bengal. It echoes in the hills of the Vindhyas and Himalayas, mingles in the music of the Yamuna and Ganga, and is chanted by the waves of the Indian Sea. I became curious how it is that such a beautiful passage became part of the Indian national anthem, and so I looked it up, and it turns out this is the first stanza of a poem. I'm not sure if it was originally written as a poem or a song because he wrote both. The name of the author is Rabindranath Tagore, an elder of India who died in 1941 at the age of 80. Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore. I'd never heard of him before. I looked more into him, and he had written 2 autobiographies over the course of his life at 2 different times, and I am interested in reading those. But in the meantime, before I get my hands on them and figure out what my local librarian can do to get me these autobiographies, in the meantime I'm sort of scanning the web and trying to figure out more about him. I did come across a 1961 documentary that was made by the Films Division of the Government of India. There could be propaganda there. It's difficult to always suss out the true nature of history from something produced by a government. And I will link that documentary if you're interested. It's about an hour long. Very good. And it's in the description box. So Rabindranath, Robi, he came from a learned and artistic family. Their family went way back to the Brahmin era in this area of India, which is eastern India, the Bengal region of eastern India. It turns out that he's descended from a long line of aristocratic people, but he also had a certain amount of wealth that he inherited from his father and his grandfather, who made much of their fortune by embracing Western ideals and by making trades and taking advantage of the British influence in the region. Rabindranath did travel quite a lot during his lifetime. He traveled to Britain. He traveled to the United States. He was actually in New York City at one time. Because he traveled so much and at such a changing time in India, he began to embrace certain practices that were typically Western, while still respecting the spiritualism and the love of land, for example, that exemplified the Indian spirit. I think that he hoped that certain Western ideals could be brought into India, such as the access to good, reasonable healthcare practices, a decent travel system, the education of everybody, especially people who are poor, especially making sure that everyone has it, including boys and girls, and just the efficient manufacture of goods. I think that he was hoping that those kind of ideas could permeate Indian culture without having the outsized influence of the conquering mentality of the British at the time. Unfortunately, it seemed as though the more British culture was brought in, the more there were these clashes between the traditional Indian ideals and the more Western ideals, with some disastrous consequences. And he witnessed a lot of these things throughout his lifetime. He was starting to produce books of poetry, music, and he was producing operas. And so he was already, in his Indian homeland, he was already quite well known, but it wasn't until he traveled to Britain and started to mingle with some people who were higher up in literary circles that his name became known to the Western world. And at that time, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913. So this is probably when he began to be known to the world writ large. Notably, Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, I didn't know this. I thought he had won the Nobel Peace Prize, but he never won it. He was nominated 5 times, but he never won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I bring up Gandhi because I'm not as versed in either of these men's history as I would like to be. But at the same time, there do seem to be a lot of parallels between their two stories. Gandhi and Rabindranath were both highly educated. They both had privilege in a country that was absolutely rife with millions and millions of people who were living in poverty. They both had great compassion for the people of their country who were living in these dire straits. Notably, neither man sought actual leadership in politics, a leader of their state or of the country as a whole. Rabindranath was a poet and a teacher. Gandhi had started off as a barrister, as a lawyer, but his noted profession later in life was actually as a weaver. So it's interesting to me that a teacher and a weaver, they're really living their ideals. They think education is important. They think that the manufacture of goods is important. And they both renounced all of their wealth and led lives that were based on the necessities of life, and definitely not on acquiring more material wealth. It occurs to me that the Indian national anthem, being based on Rabindranath's works, is symbolic of something that we kind of try to work our minds around. Just yesterday, I was having a conversation with two students who are interested in attending my short-term study abroad program where we go to India and we study healthcare concerns. As part of our conversation, one of the students, we were talking about what aspects of healthcare they were interested in studying. One of them was talking about comparing something between the Indian system and the American system. And I said, well, just so you know, this is a global heritage course. The comparison between the two countries, although it's inevitable to do that in your mind probably, it shouldn't necessarily be the basis of a thesis on these programs. A global heritage means that you are really putting yourself into the mindset of people who live in that country, and that you are developing your thesis based on what you find out from there and not necessarily comparing the two. That is not as useful. I think one of the reasons why it's not particularly useful to look at Indian culture versus the United States culture is because the mindset from which we derive our principles is so very different. And it's hard to see the reality of this until you're actually there interacting with the people and seeing the way that they live their day-to-day lives. But I actually do think that our national anthems are emblematic of that. So if you look at the United States national anthem, we talk about the flag. It's all about the flag, which is a symbol of ownership, of conquering. You know, a battle happened yesterday. You wake up in the morning and you say, whose flag is still flying above this land? Oh, it's our flag, so we own this land now. The concept of land ownership is completely opposite to the way that many cultures interact with land. And there's many examples of this. I don't want to go off too far about it, but there's many examples of this through history. Conquering peoples will come along and they will say, oh, you Native people don't own the land, well, we own it now. You know, think of Native Americans versus the conquering individuals who came along and said, now we own this. Now we're going to make it all legal. Or when you think about the Israeli-Palestinian interactions, the same thing. The Palestinians didn't have a relationship with the land that was based on ownership. They had a different interaction with the land. The Israelis came along and they made it all legal. And they said, we own this now. We're going to give you this, and then we own this over here. It's just such a totally different mentality, and it's caused many, many problems through history. So when you look at the United States anthem, it's based on a symbol of conquering the land, not really the land itself, but rather a symbol of the ownership of the land. When you look at the British national anthem, it's based on a monarch who is largely symbolic, especially now. There's really no political clout at all in the royal family, and yet they continue, sort of like a flag, to just be touted out at certain national events, and people are able to look at them and take comfort in the fact that they are still in control of things. Whereas The Indian national anthem actually is about the land. We visit India in January, which is a pretty cold month, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, when it's like 45 degrees out, there are people who will bathe in the Ganges River because that is a part of their ritual. They have so much respect for the land that they will suffer personal discomfort in order to interact and embed themselves inside of a river that they consider a god. The Ganges River is a god, Gunga. The Himalayan mountains is another god. There's a reason why, you know, the Beatles went to India and spent some time in India and came back changed. There's a reason why Alanis Morissette spent some time in India and came back and wrote a song about her. There is something about the true nature of how Indian people interact with the land that can be life-changing. So without further ado, here is the Indian National Anthem. I'm going to be reading the lyrics and listening carefully to make sure I'm following the correct rhythms, which aren't always completely intrinsically obvious. Jana Gana Mana Adniyaya Kanjaya Hey Bharata Bhagya Vedata Punjab Sindhu Gujarata Maratha Ravita Utkala Banga Vinya Himachala Yamuna Ganga Uchala Jalandi Taranga Tava Shubhiname Yajage Tava Shubha Asisamage Gaye Tava Jaya Gata Jana Gana Mangala Dayaka Jaya Hey Bharata Bhagya Vedata Jaya Hey Jaya Hey Jaya Hey Jaya 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 Hey